What's up, everybody? Max Friedman here, also known to the Twitter world as Trademark MMA. Today we're going to be discussing UFC Fight Night 95, coming to you live Saturday, September 24th from Brasilia, Brazil. The main event featuring Chris Cyborg Giustiano taking on the UFC newcomer Lena Landsberg. Cyborg, as we saw, UFC 198, a first-round finish over Leslie Smith. She is now the main event of a UFC Fight Night card in Brazil, and she is facing a UFC newcomer. I think the UFC really saw Cyborg's ability to sell a pay-per-view. She was on the pay-per-view spot at UFC 198 back in May. As we know, this fight will be contested at 140 pounds. It's a tough weight cut for Cyborg. She's fought most of her career at 145 pounds, never fought at the women's bantamweight level of 135. There has been some issues surfacing on the internet between her and her nutritionist, George Lockhart, locked and loaded system. Overall, though, Chris Cyborg, one of the most dangerous strikers on the planet. Lena Landsberg, a lot of unknown here. It's interesting to see the UFC is bringing in someone who's mostly fought at bantamweight before for this 140-pound contest. Granted, it's easier for someone who normally fights at bantamweight 135 to make that 140-pound limit. But, you know, there are many options out there at 145 pounds that I'm sure would have loved that main event slot as well. Landsberg, mostly known as a striker, we've seen her talk about her Muay Thai and kickboxing experience. But overall, I think she's in for trouble here. Chris Cyborg's just going to be too much. She's fought the best that the world has to offer for the last certain number of years. I think Chris Cyborg's going to get a finish in Brazil. The crowd's going to go crazy. And this is the first or second round finish for you here. Co-main event, former UFC bantamweight champion Renan Barão taking on Philippe Nover. Barão coming off his 145 featherweight debut. That was back at UFC Fight Night 88 in May against Jeremy Stephens. A pretty close fight. Many believe Barão actually won. But he did look good. I thought he really put together his combinations. He took what Stephens had to offer and definitely looked less drawn out than some of those title fights back at bantamweight. I think this is a favorable matchup for Barão. He matches up well against Philippe Nover. Nover is 1-1 in his return since coming back to the UFC in May of 2015. Last fought back at UFC Fight Night 80 in December, a somewhat lackluster performance against Zubair Tukhugov. Philippe Nover, you never know what you're going to get. He looked like he had a world of potential coming off The Ultimate Fighter Season 8. Couldn't put it together in the UFC, was kind of a journeyman, went around to different organizations, had a stint in Bellator, came back. Has a lot of potential, but never really can put it together. I think this is a tailor-made matchup for Barão, and he'll either get that decision or ultimately submit Philippe Nover before the end of the final bell. Heavyweights Roy Big Country Nelson and Antonio Bigfoot Silva collide on the main card. Nelson, I think we can all agree his best days are behind him. His last few performances really haven't been anything to write home about. Bigfoot also experiencing a lot of struggles as of late. Been knocked out in 5 of his last 7. We saw him get knocked out by Stefan Struve back in May in UFC Rotterdam. Odds favoring Big Country big time. A minus 450 favorite. I like Nelson a lot here. I think he gets it done by way of knockout. Bigfoot Silva, you hate to see him take unnecessary punishment. And, you know, as great of his career as he's had, I think the days might be behind him, and it might be soon time to hang up the gloves. We got a real fun one in the lightweight division between Francisco Massaranduba Trinaldo taking on Paul the Irish Dragon Felder. Very close matchup, two very diverse strikers. Trinaldo has won 6 straight fights, although one being a controversial W over Norman Park, but very strong performances, especially against Chad Laprise. He finished in the first round, really outpointed Ross Pearson for 3 rounds, and then is coming off a fight of the night at UFC 198, an absolute war against Yancy Medeiros, where he's the clear winner. Felder, meanwhile, has also won. He's won 2 straight, last being at that UFC Fight Night 88. Garbrandt Almeida card versus Josh Berkman. High-level, high-octane striking here. If Massaranduba can get off those kicks, those body kicks, those leg kicks, keep Felder at range, not let him get off his spinning attacks and let him get comfortable, I think he wins this fight. But I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to take the underdog Felder at plus 115. I think this is a small play here, might return a decent-sized bet. Felder has been extremely impressive. We know he is in Albuquerque training at the Cowboy Ranch as a part of Jackson Winklejohn MMA. Felder gets it done here. I think he brings his best performance to date against a very tough opponent in Trinaldo. Moving on to the middleweights, we have Thiago Marreta Santos taking on Eric Spicely. Thiago Santos has really come a long way with improvement since his time on The Ultimate Fighter Brazil Season 2. That was actually a welterweight. All of his UFC fights have been at middleweight. He's an extremely good athlete. Yes, he's coming off a tough loss at UFC 200 to Gegard Mousasi, but Mousasi's been on an absolute roll and just a little bit overmatched in that fight. Santos has been training full-time at American Top Team in Florida. I think this is his fight to lose. Spicely, we haven't really seen him find his footing yet inside the UFC. He was finished in the first round by Andrew Sanchez on the most recent season of The Ultimate Fighter, then finished by Sam Alvey at UFC Fight Night 92 back in Sioux Falls in July. To me, this is the biggest mismatch on the card. Santos can beat Spicely wherever the fight takes him. I see Santos picking him apart on the feet and finishing this fight by strikes before the final bell and well before the final bell. Kicking off the main card, we got a pair of featherweights. Godofredo Pepe Castro taking on Mike Della Torre, the MMA lab out in Arizona. Pepe, he certainly has an ability to finish. We saw the flying knee knockout of Noah Lahat, triangle choke over Deshaun Johnson, and that flying triangle finish over Andre Fili. Coming off a tough loss, though, in Chicago back in July against Aaron Elkins. Started off the fight well, but as it wore on, gassed quite a bit. And Elkins was able to grind, use his patented style to get a decision win. Pepe, very big for the weight class, but another thing to keep in mind, he is coming on a bit of a short notice here. This fight was originally Renato Moicano against De La Torre. For De La Torre, this will be his first fight since a November win over Yui Chulneam back in Seoul, South Korea. That was in November 2015. Certainly has power. We've seen it. Knocked out Thiago Trator back in 2015. Although he has been finished inside the octagon as well. We saw him finished by Maximo Blanco. We saw him choked out by Brian Ortega, despite that being ultimately turned to a no contest when Ortega failed his post-fight drug test. This is a close fight. If De La Torre can keep it on the feet, I think he has a good chance to land one of those bombs. But Pepe is extremely long. He is a dangerous grappler. I think if he gets to the fight to the ground, Pepe can win via submission, and I'm going to go with that as my official prediction. Pepe via submission, round 2. The featured fight on the UFC prelims for Fight Night 95 features a good clash between Michel Tractor Prozeres and Gilbert Dorino Burns coming out of the Black Zillions camp. Both coming off extremely impressive wins. Burns, we saw a slick armbar submission back over Lucas Sayuski back at UFC Fight Night 90 in July, and that was an armbar that you don't see typically in an MMA fight, more that you see in jiu-jitsu competitions where you transition from the guy's back to take an armbar. Now in MMA, we don't see that too often because a lot of times you'll sacrifice position, but in jiu-jitsu, a lot of times with the gi, you have a grip where you're able to keep that position if you are not able to successfully pull it off. Michel Prozeres also coming off an impressive win. That was back in July in Chicago over J.C. Cottrell, where I think he really put together all his tools in that fight. We saw great cardio, something that had burned him in the past. We saw him very light and elusive on his feet. We saw him using his wrestling, his power, his strength advantage, and I believe he brings that into this fight as well. It's a very tough fight to call. You got to give the wrestling advantage and power to Prozeres, but certainly the jiu-jitsu edge and probably the range striking as well to Burns. Staying away betting-wise, although Burns is a minus 185 favorite, I'm going to go with Burns as my prediction. I think the Black Zillions have really found their stride as a camp. Burns is extremely decorated in jiu-jitsu and is always improving his striking game. I see him getting the decision win here, but once again, tough to call, staying away from on the betting card. We also have a good stylistic bantamweight clash as Hani Yaya takes on Michinori Tanaka. Yaya showing extremely impressive control against top prospect Matthew Lopez. That was back in July, UFC Fight Night 92 in Sioux Falls. Yaya, the book on him, tremendous Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He will have that home crowd advantage, and he's a tough, gritty veteran. He's been in there with the likes of a lot of tough fighters over the years. Tanaka, Comes out of Team Alpha Male Japan, also trains quite a bit at Team Alpha Male in Sacramento. We've seen Chris Holdsworth rave about his grappling. He's a very good athlete. Coming off an impressive win over Joe Soto. That was back at UFC 195 in January after serving a PED suspension, kept him out of action for over a year. This is a tough fight to call, too. If Yaya is able to maintain that top position, get this fight to the ground, I think he has a chance to win. But I'm going to pick Tanaka here, the underdog. I think I'd avoid the betting line, but Tanaka himself has good grappling. I think he can keep the fight on the feet. He's the better athlete of the two. And I believe his work with Team Alpha Male will really improve and showcase in this fight. Ranked flyweights colliding here is the number 3 ranked Jussier Formiga out of Nobu União battles number 12, Dustin Ortiz, a product of Rufus Sport. For Formiga, really impressive since his early UFC losses to Joseph Benavidez and John Dodson. I think he's really found his stride. Nobu União guy hasn't fought since last November. It was a close decision loss back in Mexico City to Henry Cejudo. Many gave him the odds on the scorecard, but it ultimately did go to Cejudo. Extremely impressive performances to date. Against Wilson Hayes, we saw him implement his game plan. Zach Makovsky, the huge underdog that came in and really took it to Makovsky. For Ortiz, you never know what you're going to get. Are you going to get the killer who smashed Willie Gates back in August of 2015 in Nashville, or the guy who fades? We've seen him fade against Hayes. We saw him fade against Joseph Benavidez. Ortiz, an extremely strong wrestler, comes from a good camp in Rufus Sport, as we said. My prediction here, Jussier Formiga is going to mitigate that wrestling advantage. He has an extremely impressive ground game, ever-improving striking, tons of good training partners down there in Brazil. Formiga gets the W here, and I would take a bet on this at minus 200 for Formiga. Moving down the card, we have some welterweights colliding here. Brazilians battling each other. Eric Silva taking on Luan Chagas. This fight was actually made by 2 fighters falling out. Silva originally slated to face Brandon Thatch. Chagas slated against Shinsho Ansai. Both Ansai and Thatch received injuries, hence easy matchmaking for Joe Silva, pitting these two together. It's been a tough stretch for Eric Silva. He's had back-to-back losses to Neil Magny and back at UFC 197, or I believe UFC 196 rather, in March. Took that knockout loss to Nordine Taleb. A lot of speculation on his performance and his physique since the USADA testing took over. Speculation though, no accusations on our end. But now Silva at King's MMA with the master Rafael Cordero. It will be interesting to see if his game has improved. Chagas, he impressed the hell out of me back at UFC 198. He showed some really strong striking. Was in there against a tough opponent, Sergio Moraes, one of the guys with the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in all of MMA. He has the finishing ability. 12 finishes and 14 wins. I'm going to go out on a limb here. Chagas by an upset via the knockout. You heard it here first, folks. The featured fight on UFC Fight Pass this week will be Alan Patrick versus Stevie Braveheart Ray at lightweight. Patrick, coming off a decision win over Damian Brown, really used his wrestling and his grappling to establish some good top control. For Patrick, typically a little wild on the feet, but always a tough test. Granted, he is 3-1 inside the octagon. Ray, on the other hand, 3-0. But however, coming off a nearly year-long layoff, had to be pulled from the Ultimate Fighter finale card back in July. He was originally slated to face Jake Matthews, was ultimately replaced by Kevin Lee. Ray's got the ability to finish. We saw him finish Marcin Bandel in his UFC debut. A very impressive finish over Leonardo Mafra. I like Ray in this fight, and I like it for a TKO. I think his striking is a little more crisp. He has great cardio and strength and conditioning, does his diet with Mike Dolce. I think his technical striking will be a little too much for Patrick. I'm going to go ahead and score one for the visitors here, giving Ray the W. Vicente Luque battles Hector Urbina at welterweight in a clash of the ever-blossoming rivalry between American Top Team and the Black Zillions. Luque, Black Zillions are extremely high on him. He's been impressive in the UFC. He saw that Anaconda choke submission over Haider Hassan, scored another submission victory over Alvaro Chango Herrera back in July. Black Zillions have been on a roll too. think they've really found their stride from the coaching standpoint. George Santiago, Henry Hooft, Neil Melanson. We've seen their fighters on a roll. You know, Rumble Johnson coming off the big win. Chaz Skelly last week. Stefan Struve, Matt Mitrione in Bellator. You know, Michael Johnson. Wow, the list is endless. These guys have been winning at a ridiculous pace. Urbina, on the other hand, coming off a loss to Bartosz Fabinski where he was controlled pretty much the entire time. He was supposed to fight George Sullivan back in July, pulled when George Sullivan declared a USADA violation. I think in this fight, Vicente Luque has the edge in technical striking and grappling. Hector Urbina, meanwhile, holds the advantage in experience and raw power. I'm going to give the edge to Luque here. I think his technical striking, his strong grappling prowess, and just his coaching and his background is going to be able to lead him to the victory. Odds sitting at minus 360 for the favorite Luque. I would pair him in a parlay, perhaps with Thiago Santos, Cyborg Giustiano, maybe even throw in Roy Nelson. Some good options there for betting-wise. On to the last fight we'll take a look at. This is the first fight on the UFC Fight Pass prelims. Glyco França, the Ultimate Fighter Brazil Season 4 winner, taking on top prospect Gregor Gillespie. França replacing Joaquim Silva, although has had ample time for this camp. One of Sherdog.com's top prospects in Gillespie. I've had high hopes for França. After 4 rear naked choke wins in the Ultimate Fighter Brazil 4, he won with a very impressive rear naked choke over Fernando Bruno to capture the title. Had an impressive first round against James Vick back at UFC 197 in April. Faded quite a bit, though, and was ultimately picked apart on the feet by the superior striking of Vick for rounds 2 and 3, losing the decision. França, high-level ground game. Gillespie, on the other hand, top prospect. He's a wrestler training out of Bellamore Kickboxing Academy, Long Island MMA. Guys like Dennis Bermudez, Chris Wade, Ryan LaFleur, Andre the Bull Harrison. Good camp up there. 7-0. He was the Ring of Combat champion of Ring of Combat, a highly respected regional promotion based out of Atlantic City, New Jersey. Has sent numerous fighters to the UFC, guys like Chris Weidman, Uriah Hall, Aljamain Sterling, Ally Quinta, just to name a few. This is an interesting matchup. França, I'm going to go with as my victor here. I think this is going to be a little bit too much of a tough test for Gillespie, throwing him into Brazil in his UFC debut against an Ultimate Fighter Brazil winner. I'm going to go with França. I think he's going to be able to bounce back from that loss to James Vick, implement his game plan, and will ultimately score a submission victory here over the newcomer Gillespie. That'll do it for us this week, folks. I want to thank everybody for listening in. Please give me a follow on Twitter at TrademarkMMA. And stay tuned as we will be running this back, doing predictions and betting odds for future UFC fight cards. Thanks again.